This is Mark Goldberg with UN Dispatch, speaking with Patrick Meier of Tufts University. How are you? How are you today, Patrick? Patrick, I didn't mention to you this to you in our pre conversation, but actually, Tufts University is my undergraduate alma mater, so I'm doubly pleased to be speaking with you.
Excellent, today. Very good. Glad to hear that.
So, Patrick, you have actually more than sort of one affiliation. You have multiple affiliations. You're also a blogger at iRevolution. You're the author of iRevolution.
That's right.
And you are an expert in sort of new applications of social media in crisis situations, which is going to be the topic of our conversation today.
Great.
So I think a good starting off point for this is a report that you wrote, that you, I should say, co-authored, called New Technologies in Emergencies and Conflicts. This report, I should note, was published in part by the UN Foundation, and as regular viewers know, UN Dispatch enjoys the sponsorship of the UN Foundation. So, with that sort of disclaimer, can I ask you to sort of just give us an overview of what is included in this report, and how new information technologies are being used in both man-made and sort of natural disasters? So I'll let you take it from there.
Sure thing, absolutely. Thanks for the question, Mark. We've seen really some quite innovative uses of technology in the humanitarian space for the last couple of years, so much so that we're starting to hear terms like humanitarian technology being applied in this space now, especially in the sort of tech sector, innovative, non-profit tech companies. And what we've tried to do with this report is to shed light on what's been happening over the past just year or two. So it's really very much looking at what is happening now and starting to think about what does this mean for the future of the humanitarian space. How can humanitarian organizations start leveraging these technologies that, for the most part, have until recently been used in an ad hoc manner? And the way that we've approached this report, together with my co-author, Diane Coyle, is looked at the early warning side, the sort of current in situations of conflict phase, and then how does technology get leveraged in a post-conflict situation for rehabilitation, employment, and so on and so forth. So it's been really very interesting to highlight some really innovative projects like Ushahidi, and other colleagues of ours, from GeoCommons to Development Seed to some of the projects that our colleagues at Instead are doing, as well as the Joint Research Center, which is part of the European Commission based out of Italy, and the World Food Programme, and other UN agencies. It was very interesting writing this report, because we were really writing about things that were being developed, as we speak. And with some of the case studies being case studies for projects that are being implemented really over the past few months. So it's been very exciting.
Yeah. Can you maybe sort of, I think it's hard at least for me to sort of picture what exactly you mean by sort of using these sort of new media technologies in crisis situations. Can you, I guess, give us a couple examples of the case studies that you mentioned, of sort of how, just kind of show us how this works on the ground in action?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks. And that's where I should have started, really. We're increasingly, we being the humanitarian community writ large, UN agencies, donors, and other major international organizations, are increasingly looking at the role of information as being as critical as food, as water, as medicine in times of crises. That information and access to information can make the difference between a hazard and then a disaster. Hazards can be weathered, by mitigation and taking shelter and so on. So hazards don't have to actually translate into disasters, but they do when sometimes there's a crisis of information, the lack of information that prevents individuals and local organizations from getting forward sort of information on these hazards, whether they're man-made or natural disasters. So having early warning information is critical to whether or not a local at-risk population is going to get impacted by whatever shock we might be trying to warn about. So being able to communicate that information, and obviously more and more we're seeing some very exciting ways to collect information and to communicate that information, whether it's leveraging user-generated content thanks to social media, from Twitter, from YouTube, from Flickr, from crowdsourcing text messages. That's all of an example of what we mean by information collection in a humanitarian technology sense. And of course, satellite imagery and aerial imagery often provide an at-a-glance understanding of dynamics that are taking place. And if this information can be captured and communicated in near real time, the hope is that individuals can then take appropriate measures and take more informed decisions, whether it's with other organizations or individual decisions, to basically safeguard their livelihoods. That's one example. So very concretely, I can use the case of Ushahidi, which is an open source and free platform.
You mentioned Ushahidi earlier, and I was actually hoping you might sort of explain sort of what that is and how that got started.
I'd be happy to, absolutely. Ushahidi got started in December 2007, January 2008, during the post-election violence in Kenya, when a number of tech bloggers connected to Kenya, or part of the diaspora, felt that they needed to do something when they realized that the mainstream media was being somewhat constrained, and that a number of NGOs and official organizations that had a mandate to share vital information on the crisis were actually not sharing that information, which is somewhat problematic to say the least. So
why weren't they sharing this information?
A number of factors. Some are typical to UN agencies and humanitarian NGOs. One way that we like to describe it is this: they have a data hugging disorder, where there's this proprietary mentality that, as if you have data, then that makes you special in the sense that you have leverage, you have information that somebody doesn't have, and so it's a bit of a power trip. Sometimes. I'm not saying that this is the case all the time. Absolutely not. But I unfortunately have had, personal experiences in having to deal with that kind of mentality, which is unfortunate. But there are also other concerns sometimes. They don't want to be affiliated with information that are being collected for maybe security reasons. Maybe the information is too sensitive, or they're not able to find an easy way to make some of the information public and some of the other information private. So the default sort of mindset is, we're just going to sit on this information and not share it. And some of the election monitoring organizations kept on sitting on this data, and it wasn't until after months following the elections that some of this information got released. But so that was somewhat unfortunate. Some of this example of trying to collaborate with some of these NGOs on the ground, national and international NGOs, and asking them to share information proved to be a bit disappointing. And then seeing that mainstream media was constrained by political forces, and also by the very fact that the mainstream media cannot be everywhere at the same time. That's just by definition. That's absolutely no criticism whatsoever. It's just a matter of fact.
So the need was there. And you said that you said Kenyans in the diaspora sort of came up with the Ushahidi idea.
A combination of colleagues in Kenya at the time, a colleague that was in Eldoret and tweeting about the violence taking place just outside her window. Another colleague out of Nairobi who actually had to leave the country because of death threats as a prominent Kenyan blogger. She got a lot of attention, both good and bad. And then a couple of colleagues of ours with either Kenyan or raised in Kenya with strong Kenyan connections in the U.S., mostly on the East Coast, getting involved in putting the first version of this platform together and up on the web in a matter of days after the violence broke out.
Mm-hmm. And I guess explain, I guess, just how it worked, and sort of
Sure.
if you can, sort of what impact it had inside Kenya, if any.
Sure, absolutely, be happy to. So we use the word crowdsourcing and crowdsourcing crisis information to describe what lies at the heart of Ushahidi. A lot of other organizations, collect information in a very strict, highly defined protocol of who is going to collect that information, who's going to validate, who's it going to get communicated to, and usually the sort of the wiring, if you will, of that information is very top down. It goes one way and it doesn't get shared. So what we do with Ushahidi is take almost a Wikipedia approach. I think Wikipedia is the best example to give, simply because I think more people are familiar with the Wikipedia than perhaps other initiatives. But Wikipedia is an excellent example of crowdsourcing, where you have an open platform, a free and open platform where anybody who has access to the internet can go online and contribute to whatever entries and hopefully make this online encyclopedia better. We take that kind of mindset to crisis information, and part of the driving motivation behind this is because we feel that individuals on the ground have every right to report on what's happening around them, and that in the context of elections, it's about people-powered citizen, monitoring of elections, and that enables, or at least gives the option of individuals who feel so inclined to take ownership of this process, to be directly engaged in the outcome of this process beyond just this sort of one-off vote. There's a lot more that citizens can do to help report information in quasi-real time on any kind of election irregularities or fraud, for example, violence, voter intimidation, assaults, and so on. So elections are not just about the voting booth and just taking numbers that are coming out of the polls. Of course, that's critical, but the elections start before you put in your ballot, and it's very important that we start collecting that. Individuals on the ground, collect this information for themselves. We don't hold this data. We don't own this data as Ushahidi. It really is about crowdsourcing information and then allowing these individuals to have access to this information through something that we call crowd feeding, which is a feature on Ushahidi that allows individuals to subscribe to the alerts that they are themselves sending to the Ushahidi platform. So it really is trying to do horizontal, meshed sort of networking of information, as opposed to a very top-down, hierarchical, centralized, proprietary, data-hugging disorder type approach.
I guess, what, at least to me it seems, what makes sort of something like Ushahidi work is the fact that, the sort of cell phone use in a place like Kenya, or frankly, in most of the developing world, is rising at sort of an unprecedented rate, and has risen at an unprecedented rate, over the last 10 years. I feel like this is probably one of the great sort of stories of our times, is sort of not only are cell phones being used in greater numbers, but the technology available is, cell phones are like little computers now. And in places, I guess, without stable, internet connections, this could be helpful and useful.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and just to connect that with the previous conversation, the previous question, what Ushahidi allows organizations, local NGOs, civil society groups, and even just individuals to do is to document information and reports of human rights abuses, violence, and also peace initiatives, where we talk a lot about crisis mapping, but peace mapping is equally, if not even more important, because crowdsourcing peace allows us to identify windows of opportunity. They allow us to find out what's going right in, during a conflict zone. We know that it's never total war. It was never total war during the Holocaust or in genocide. There are always pockets of cooperation. There are always individuals who are trying to do what they can to call for restraint, to get parties to come to the table and to negotiate and to basically put down their weapons. So crowdsourcing peace initiatives also is a way to document evidence that something is going right, and is then, a big flag for other organizations and donors and funders to say, right, this local group in Kibera is doing this fantastic work. We now have, a group to support, as opposed to being, limited to a map of just crisis dots all over. So that's really important. So all in all,
can I ask you actually about maybe the flip side of that, and if
Sure.
the flip side of that exists? Have you seen in your research, and I mentioned you're a doctoral student, any examples of crowdsourcing being used for social ill, being used to
Sure.
say organize violence, or just in general sort of do bad things?
Absolutely. I will definitely answer that question. I just want to tie up the last 2 points is by saying that
Please.
crowdsourcing information allows us to, and individuals on the ground, to document evidence of crises, human rights abuses, peace initiatives that would go otherwise completely undocumented and completely unreported by the mainstream media or by other NGOs or what have you, because they can't be everywhere at the same time. They don't have always the mandate to do this. So the idea is to really leverage the wisdom of the crowds and the knowledge that exists on the ground to report information that's incredibly important, but that formal, official mechanisms will simply not document. In connecting that to the smartphones and to the idea of mobile crisis mapping, SMS is, yes, it's absolutely integral to a lot of the work that we do in many of these different countries, and that's why we integrated an excellent tool called Frontline SMS, which is featured in the UN Foundation report, that basically provides the SMS feature and functionality for Ushahidi. And as you mentioned, these phones now are getting also a lot smarter, these smartphones. We realize that there's incredible potential and opportunity there as well at Ushahidi, which is why we're developing smartphone apps, not just for the high-end phones like the iPhone and maybe the Android, but also the kinds of smartphones that people have access to in places like Kenya and the DRC and what have you. And we really do think that this is going to increase in terms of the ubiquity and access of mobile phones, and then the next generation of smartphones as well is going to become increasingly available. And that's really very important because it's going to allow us to geotag crisis information and peace initiatives automatically and in real time, as opposed to doing by SMS, which requires a little more work. On the question of crowdsourcing being used for good or ill, yeah, you're absolutely right. Just like books can be used for ill or good, just like my getting on Microsoft Word can be used for ill or good, right? Mein Kampf was written in a book. Should we ban all books? And one other thing to keep in mind is yes, there's a link to my doctoral research, a pretty strong link right there in terms of looking at how technology is being used by repressive regimes and pro-democracy social movements, non-violent social movements. And it's clear that it's a cat and mouse game, and that there's learning that's happening within social movements, within repressive regimes, and then repressive regimes are not going to stand by idly. I think that is really stating the obvious. Why would they, be peaceful about stepping down because all of a sudden people are using Twitter, SMS, and Facebook? Absolutely not. What they did in Iran is they shut everything down. That's, again, it's not unprecedented. We've seen that happening for years and years and years with text messaging, with the Thai government shutting down the cell phone networks before elections and so on. So, of course, that's definitely happening. A lot of people now are starting to call attention to that. I think we need to get beyond the anecdotes as well, which is another conversation related to my dissertation. But yes, in Iran, just to give a very specific example,
please. I was hoping you'd get into that. So please do go ahead.
The regime in Iran started using a website and basically saying anybody who has pictures of individuals that were involved in the protests should post them there. So that's an example of crowdsourcing for ill. Just like Mein Kampf is an example of publishing a book for ill as well. So I think the good definitely outweighs the bad in this. I think the majority of people, most of the time, simply want to get on with life and do not necessarily have this incentive to be treacherous. Otherwise, we would be living in a state of nature, which is far from the case. And that's, again, another example why crowdsourcing peace is, I would even say, even more important than crowdsourcing conflict, because we've got this completely skewed perception of our world, which is driven largely by the mainstream media and what sells, and peace does not sell. But if individuals and organizations can start leveraging a platform like Ushahidi to start crowdsourcing peace and give individuals in Kenya, for example, a more faithful and real picture, both literally and figuratively, of what's happening in Kenya, then I think that would be a very powerful statement. And since we're both very much connected to Tufts, Mark, I wanted to also add that I got two colleagues here at Tufts University, undergraduate students, who've just started a really phenomenal project where they will be using Ushahidi starting next year to do just what I described. In fact, I've gotten this idea from them, is to crowdsource local peace initiatives and individual peace initiatives. So just by using this text message feature, as we saw in 2007, 2008, to report human rights abuses, we will be using these exact same technologies, but to basically crowdsource examples of organizations, both formal and informal, becoming engaged in peace activities, whether it's in Kibera, whether it's in Eldoret. And the idea is to map all these peace initiatives. And I think what we have in mind, talking with Rachel and Cody with this initiative, which is theirs, I think could be really interesting. Imagine if they started early, which they plan on doing early next year, 2 years before the elections are actually due, and populating a map of Kenya with thousands upon thousands of individual community-based crisis prevention and conflict resolution peace initiatives. I think it'd be an incredibly powerful message to send, as well as an incredibly important tool, operational tool for early response. As I mentioned, Ushahidi is in the business of crowdsourcing, but also crowd feeding. So what this would allow individuals to do is map themselves on the Ushahidi peace map, find out who else in their neighborhood or in their town might be doing interesting things, or maybe on the other side of the country, from Eldoret to Mombasa, and realize that there's a graffiti artist that's doing phenomenal work, using graffiti, calling for peace and restraint and so on. And so there's a learning effect that can happen. And when the elections do take place, I think this map will be incredibly important for early response, for preparedness, because these individuals, organizations, local communities, civil society groups will be able to subscribe to alerts so that they'll be the first to know by SMS, by email, what have you, when something is starting to get a little out of hand in their immediate area. So that allows them to mobilize, right away. So I think, just citing that one example, I think that can do a lot more good. I think you've certainly sold me on that for sure. I wonder though, is there any role in this for public policy? Because it seems that most of what you see right now are just are very much non-governmental, sort of entrepreneurial individuals who are creating these things, who are supporting these initiatives. But is there any role for public policy to be constructive, either at the national level here in the United States or at the international level, to sort of, I guess, be supportive of these sort of initiatives? Absolutely, an incredibly important role, and I think we saw recent news on the Civil Society 2.0 initiative coming out of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's office with some colleague of ours who are spearheading that. It's incredibly important to highlight the fact that even basic media literacy can go a long way in some of these more closed regimes, and advocating for that. Obviously, being mindful of the very real risks that crop up inevitably with that. But there are a number of digital activism groups like digiactive.org or like Digital Democracy, New Tactics for Human Rights, who are really understanding that technology is still largely an untapped potential here to providing individuals with the kinds of technologies and tactics and strategies that can be very empowering for themselves, and I think that's incredibly important. Very much linked to this public policy question is also the role of international private sector companies, the usual suspects really that are developing some of these internet filtering technologies. We've seen an outcry with respect to Cisco, to Siemens, to Nokia, I believe, that I've seen on the blogosphere.
Can you describe some of these? What this outcry is? I actually don't really know what you're talking about. So please do explain. Yeah,
sure. I think it came back in quite some force during the post-election violence in Iran, where some civil society groups were starting to accuse American technology companies as well as some European technology companies of being complicit in basically selling commercially available technology to repressive regimes like the one in Tehran that allowed them to do internet surveillance, to do internet monitoring. There were allegations that they could also trace phone calls and text messages and what have you, and this allegedly is all technology that is being produced out of Silicon Valley or in Scandinavian countries and so on. What I found surprising was that there was not even more of an uproar against this, and I think public policy has a huge role to play here. And we have all these export controls in place for various, or embargoes in place for various countries, and yet it's completely okay to start selling the Iranian regime with technology that allows them to basically track down protesters and communications between protesters. I think there's a bit of a disconnect there in terms of reality that we really need to keep in mind. I know, and at the same time, however, to be completely fair, if there were some restraints that were starting to get placed on some of these technology companies, these regimes are not going to again stand by idly and let themselves get deposed and thrown out of power. They're going to reverse engineer this technology anyway. But the point is, why make it even easier? There's absolutely no reason. If we have, if there are embargoes that make sense on certain countries, let's make sure they make sense and be a bit more coherent with our strategy.
Mm-hmm. So the sort of title of your dissertation is The Role of New Media and Technology in Popular Resistance Against Repressive Rule. I'm wondering, do you, without having read your dissertation, what would you, is sort of, can Twitter bring down a regime? I think you saw in Iran, it seems the answer would seem to be no. Is there, do you hold out the possibility that new media technologies can do this? And I guess maybe are there historical examples of before there was new media, of say old media, or the increasing access, the increased access to media, to sort of bring down sort of regimes in the past, repressive regimes in the past?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. I really appreciate the historical, thinking on these issues. We always think that because we're alive in this time and age that ours is more special than any other time and age. It's different, but there are precedents with technologies and previous information revolutions and so on. I think first of all, I would say that technology comes second. First comes tactics. strategies and vision. Actually, you start with a vision, what it is, the goals you want to accomplish, and then, well, what are the strategies that are going to help you accomplish those goals and that vision, and then finally, at the tactical level, what needs to be put in place to basically fulfill and accomplish certain strategies towards this greater vision. Technology should not come into the picture when, I think, right away, at least, when we're starting to think about popular resistance movements in repressive contexts. Revolutions were possible before Twitter, and they will be possible after Twitter, if there's an after Twitter. So that's what we really need to keep in mind. I think the Global Post had a great article around the time of the elections in Iran in June, I believe, where I think revolutions before Twitter must have been the name of it. And basically identifying 3 or 4 examples in different countries in the last 100 years where there were examples of some of these revolutions that created some stir in the solidarity movement in Poland is usually one that gets cited, and that was using newspapers, leaflets, and so on. So the first thing we need to do is get up to speed on the very rich and diverse tactics and strategies that exist in the field of civil resistance, non-violent civil resistance, and then to go back and look at the technologies that are available to us to identify what technologies will allow us to have a multiplier effect in a way on the various strategies, allow us to have an added advantage potentially by leveraging these technologies when we try and accomplish certain tactics. So that's the first way to think about it. Twitter in Iran was used more to get the word out. It was not the ideal tool to start mobilizing groups because, Twitter's an open platform. The regime was on it. As soon as some folks in the West, specifically in the U.S., who meant well, who started tweeting proxy server addresses and so on so that colleagues in Iran could circumvent the censorship, they were closed down. It was basically posting information on the door of the regime for all intents and purposes. So I think people are learning slowly. These are new technologies. But Twitter, more in terms of getting the information out, I think, obviously to coordinate, mobilize, and organize a social movement does require sometimes secure communication and sharing. I think ultimately that the best way to describe what's been happening, not just since the Twitter age, but from books onwards, radios, televisions, and so on, is that it's going to be a bit of a cat and mouse game. It's going to be used for different purposes, and ultimately, where I stand is that it's going to be a cat and mouse game. But I'd like to think, and have some reasons to back that up, that control is slipping inevitably from these repressive regimes, whether they like it or not, and it has to do less with technology, in fact, and a lot more to do with organizational theory, which is actually quite straightforward. It's very clear from the study of complexity science, complex systems, network dynamics, that centralized hierarchical organizational structures, i.e., mega bureaucracies, paranoid mega bureaucracies, simply are not able to innovate, to learn, and to adapt as quickly to a rapidly changing environment. And the best analogy here is evolution and ecology in organisms. Organisms that can adapt quickly will be able to, for the most part, perhaps adapt to the shocks of climate change and so on. But the big centralized organisms like the bureaucracies that represent some of these hierarchical repressive regimes, there's a wind of change happening. And the example that I cited about the website being used by the regime to crowdsource pictures, that was not something they learned themselves, right? They saw this happening amongst social movements and dissident movements and so on and so forth. So repressive regimes are, for the most part, overall, I think, in the long term, going to be reactionary. Innovation, new technologies, new applications of technologies, creative applications of technologies are going to first come from the civil resistance the tech side, the geeks as we like to call them, before these regimes. And so I think they are in a reactionary stance, and I think unlike repressive regimes, social movements tend to be a little more decentralized, and by definition, decentralized networks are able to innovate, adapt far more quickly than repressive centralized regimes, and they have often a first mover advantage, which is why a tool like Twitter, sort of defeats the whole, purpose of first option of first mover advantage. If you're going to broadcast to everyone, including the repressive regime, what you're about to do, that you're going to congregate in the square at 4 o'clock, is that a first mover advantage? I don't think so. That's why it's very important for these social movements, many of which already are now up to speed on how to communicate securely in repressive environments, can go ahead and do so and keep learning. So I think it's about adaptation and a learning curve. But until further notice, I think it's going to continue being a cat and mouse game, but ultimately one that I don't think that the regimes are going to be able to stay ahead in.
The mouse will win.
I think so.
Yeah. So we're about out of time, but is there anything else? Anything sort of we left out? I left out in asking you, or anything else you wanted to talk about before we sign off?
Maybe just two things. Just to tag on the cat and mouse. I think one thing to keep in mind is that there will always be more mice than cats. Right, and maybe a better analogy is the 500-pound gorilla and then the mouse. I mean, which one is more agile and so on and so forth? The mouse can hide, and unfortunately, that's not only pro-democracy mice, but also resist, terrorist movements and networks and so on. But to conclude, I think it's been a phenomenal experience working on this report with my co-author and the fantastic team at the UN Foundation. It's really just been an incredible treat. It's been wonderful collaborating with them. They've been incredibly supportive. I really applaud the UN Foundation for their forward thinking to really start writing about, projects and initiatives that are just now happening. And, let's see what happens, what the future brings over the next 6-9 months, 2 years. But I really appreciate that an organization like the UN Foundation was committed to this project and to this kind of forward thinking and seeing, okay, it's not quite clear, the picture is starting to come into focus, but it's not entirely crystal clear yet. But even then, can we start, identifying certain potential areas here of opportunity where these technologies can be applied in the humanitarian setting to improve early warning, coordination and response during crises, and then the post-conflict, post-disaster stage. So I'm really looking forward to the feedback that we hope to get from readers, and it's not going to be just a one-off. We're going to be setting up a communication channel, I think blogs or wikis, to continue the conversation. It's really meant to stimulate conversation further and to try and enrich the discourse on this topic.
Well, you'll certainly be at the center of that conversation, and thank you. This is fascinating. This topic, I think, is rich and it's evolving and it's new and it'll be fun to watch. So thank you, and I'll certainly be reading iRevolution daily. So thanks.
Thanks so much, man.
All right.